It's not a problem of like operators. It's a problem of technical debt, right, within the supply chain. Every entity has optimized for their own operations because they had to, right? It's a competitive market. So, and for the most part, operators that have physical product and are moving physical product, their supply chain is their IP, right? So it's no surprise, companies would protect their IP, which is their supply chain, and silo their technology, silo their processes. But now we're in a different world, right? Where disruptions are occurring every day, and those disruptions have a much broader and greater impact within their supply chain. And so there's a total shift and transformation in thinking on what it means to be collaborative, what it means to adopt new technology to improve efficiencies, right? And it really, frankly, invests in new technologies.
You're listening to Freight Famous, presented by Rose Rocket, bringing you the people that make trucking move. From behind the scenes into the limelight. Here's your host, Justin Bailie.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Freight Famous, brought to you by Rose Rocket from the Rose Rocket Studios in downtown Toronto. I am your host, Justin Bailie, and on this podcast that we bring to you about every 2 weeks, we're going to teach transportation companies how to build, scale, and automate their transportation business. With us today is Justin Young from Prologis. Justin has a host of experience in the space, all the way back to selling warehouse spacing at C.H. Robinson, and now currently works on the venture team at Prologis, making investments in companies in the startup space, but specifically in and around supply chain. So today on the call with Justin, we're going to talk about what venture capital actually is, how to think about investing in companies in the space, maybe like Rose Rocket, and then also just a little bit of sort of on his point of view on what's coming next and some of the interesting things that he's starting to see. I think it's important to talk to people in venture in terms of they're really paid to try to predict and see the future. So join us for some insights from Justin. I think it's going to be a really interesting show today. Justin, thanks for coming on the show. It's good of you to be here, man.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. Super pumped on the progress of Rose Rocket over the last couple of years. And I do remember Rose Rocket was one of the few teams that had a team full of Justins. So I'm happy to interact. And for the audience who's only listening to this via audio, there has to be a clear way to make a distinction between us two. We're both Justins, and we're both talking about freight.
This is a good call. So around here, because of the Justin problem that we have, and for those listening, when we first started, there's the co-founders are Justin, and Alex, and then as you can appreciate, our first hire was also an Alex. So for the early days, it was Justin, Alex, and so because I'm the oldest and the tallest, I got to decide on who got what nickname. So I took JB. So maybe for the purpose of this show, you can refer to me as JB, so the listeners won't be confused. Although I imagine our voices are quite different, but let's not make assumptions here. I do want to. I was really looking forward to this call today. You and I have talked in the past. I wouldn't describe this as close friends, but I think we certainly got along pretty well. I always liked the vibe from you, and I hope you felt the same from me. It usually takes one to know one, so it tends to work that way. But I remember first hearing about Prologis, and I know the logo. I've seen it, and smart people I've talked to, I said, that company? They're like, I know the logo, but I don't know what they do. So refresh my memory and those listening, maybe if you're hearing it for the first time, of what Prologis is.
Yeah, sure. So Prologis is one of those companies within the supply chain that you've never heard of. And we're a Fortune 70 company at this point. And so Prologis, as far as the parent goes, we are the largest owner-developer of logistics real estate. So the warehouses that your goods are stored in, from your Amazon e-commerce purchases to your palletized shipments that comes right off the steamships, there's a high probability that your product is stored at a Prologis facility. Prologis owns 1 billion square feet of real estate across 19 countries. And as you can imagine, right, our customer base is Amazon, Walmart, DHL, FedEx, right? Any operator that really moves physical goods from A to B. Yeah, go ahead.
Just in the, I guess the to kind of summarize, to kind of come into that a little bit. So you've got a lot of real estate in supply chain. So I can imagine the last period of time has been a pretty it's a pretty good time to be at Prologis or a shareholder. Is it a publicly traded company?
It is. Yeah, it is publicly traded, and I think we're in the high 60s on the Fortune 500 list.
Yeah, that's I remember hearing some of that data when we first spoke, and just again not really having it. I think I see the odd box truck with a Prologis sign on it, right? So I think is this a 200 truck carrier? No, but it's the largest supply chain real estate holder developer in the world. So what we're going to talk about today isn't so much around that aspect, but more the technology and the venture side of it where you sit. So why venture? Why does Prologis decide to, obviously has an incredible business. What is it? Why would they start getting into venture? I think there are a lot of obvious reasons, and maybe we'll kind of flush those out today as to why that could be challenging, difficult, and different. I think the synergies are sort of partially obvious, but what happened and why?
Yeah, so I'll start with sort of the real estate play, and then where we sit within the supply chain and why venture. So in real estate, it's a funny business because there's no other business in the world. And we joke about this within the ventures group all the time. We're one of the few businesses where, we put in a lot of work to get a customer to sign a lease, and we never talk to them for the next 5 to 10 years. There's no other business in the world that does that, right? Customer experience is sort of non-existent until you want to sign a lease or re-up a lease, right? Or if there's any sort of fixtures that needs to be maintained at a building. And so, with that, we understood, or at least, the leadership of Prologis from the venture's inception about 6 years ago, realized that, in the industrial real estate market is fairly commoditized, right? What differentiates 4 walls and a roof? And when customers go and lease these buildings, they're looking at price per square feet, and they're trying to find the best price per square foot. So how do you differentiate yourself as an asset owner in this market? So that was one sort of thought at a high level that the company sort of always had. But then second, 2015, 2016, we started to see venture capital trickle into the supply chain space, right? The earliest version of this was, Cargomatic in 2014 with, digitizing the box truck shipments, Flexport, right? Very soon after, if not at the same time, digitizing freight forwarding, right? And it was the first time we start to see really venture capital pay attention to this market. And given that there was more entrepreneurs, there's more sort of corporates and operators talking about technology adoption. And then with that, naturally, operators began to really talk about the pain points in the industry. And from a real estate perspective, and from a company like Prologis, who's always very curious about how do we solve customer pain points, we started to listen, right? And when we start to listen over and over again on the same thematic pain points that occur across our customers, we figured we're in probably the best position to help solve those pain points from constituents either upstream or downstream of that warehouse. And so we began a ventures group, right? And the ventures group was really with a thesis of we represent so many constituents in the supply chain, whether directly or indirectly, right? The shippers lease our buildings, trucking companies interact with our facilities, and upstream from that, suppliers ship product to our facilities as well. And so they all have the same problem sets and the same pain points, and they're ubiquitous. And we're a neutral player. We don't operate buildings. All we do is lease buildings, and we represent everyone in the supply chain that needs physical real estate. And so, we go out to the market. We try to understand what are the most ubiquitous pain points across the supply chain, and we try to find technologies to solve for those pain points. And that's how Ventures was started in about 6 years ago, 5.5 years ago. We have 35 supply chain tech companies in our portfolio. It continues to grow. I think to date, we've deployed close to $140 million in capital over the last 5.5 years. And just some notable companies that you may not have heard of. Flexport was an early one. Flex, FL, EXE, or some people call it Flexi, right? Two-sided, digital warehousing marketplace, Cargomatic, Emerge. The list really continues.
Yeah, it's a pretty impressive portfolio, and I think what's equally impressive is that the idea of spinning up, and I'm going to use different terms here, an innovation lab, a venture arm from large corporations is pretty in vogue today. Quite, it's not right. You don't see a lot of companies that aren't Fortune 500 doing some version of this, and I sort of where I sit in our business at Rose Rocket have had the opportunity to speak to quite a few of them, in varying degrees of are we going to do business together just to tell me what you guys are doing, sort of a two-sided conversation. And I'm largely concerned about those initiatives because it's very difficult, and I've seen it to be, and I'm not sure that the funds, I'll call them funds loosely as a term, are maybe even actively aware of this, but they really will take on the ethos of the organization, which is bureaucratic, slow, quite frankly, what venture shouldn't be. And I want to talk a little bit about what venture actually is, and we'll kind of maybe use this as a segue to that. But how have you been able to maintain what looks to be if you were to look at your portfolio, this looks like a well-disciplined, well-invested, healthy portfolio that could really rival any, we'll call it sort of seed style investing, and deploying capital, moving quick, over a period of time where it didn't get shut down because of some corporate change or a recession or whatever that might be. It seems to have its own legs and its own sort of heart to it. And so how do you keep it, quite frankly, uncorrupted from the large Fortune 70 organization on the other side?
Yeah, great comments. And I know that pain. And before Prologis, I was with another corporate venture arm of a multinational telco. And then before that, for the audience, I was a freight broker, right? And I sold software that really wasn't great. From the number one broker in North America. You can see my LinkedIn on who that was.
You can say C.H. Robinson. I'll say it for you. There you go. C.H. Robinson. I'll save you the click on LinkedIn. He gave you all the clues anyway. Yeah.
Well, so it's C.H. Robinson, and I think anyone that came from the freight brokerage market, really, really understands, how hard it is to be a freight broker, to work with customers, delight customers, maintain SLAs. And so, all of us that come from the space went through the ringer, and we know, how to be a good operator. But it was sort of like grad school within a couple of years, But anyways, and before that, spent time at a startup. So the accumulation of all these things, the learnings from startup, operator, venture capital, now the second venture capital organization that I'm part of, I think collectively our group has very similar experiences. And so we know what sort of works and what doesn't. And I'll tell you, from a corporate level, Prologis, with a $150 billion market cap, maybe it's higher at this point, continues to grow, 200-something billion under assets under management. We only have 1,500 people in the company. So we're a very lean company. It doesn't take a lot of people to run a really great real estate business. And so with that, naturally, there isn't a whole lot of, bureaucracy. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, because our thesis is really focused on solving our customer pain points, not our own, we don't also have to go through that bureaucracy. And it's actually very, the organization actually admires and supports the fact that we are trying to be close to our customers and we are trying to solve those pain points. Because, when the market comes to your landlord and says, hey, we have problems sourcing capacity and transportation. We have problems storing more inventory. We have problems forecasting. We have problems forecasting customer demand. We have right? When operators are chatting with their landlords about the problems within their operations, that's when there is a real significant problem in the market, right? And it's not a problem of like operators. It's a problem of technical debt right, within the supply chain, every entity has optimized for their own operations because they had to, right? It's a competitive market. So, and for the most part, operators that have physical product and are moving physical product, their supply chain is their IP, right? So it's no surprise, companies would protect their IP, which is their supply chain, and silo their technology, silo their processes. But now we're in a different world, right, where disruptions are occurring every day, and those disruptions have a much broader and greater impact within their supply chain. And so there's a total shift and transformation in thinking on what it means to be collaborative, what it means to adopt new technology to improve efficiencies, right? And it really, frankly, invest in new technologies.
You said something there, I think that was really, really important. So I want to just make sure we don't glance over that, is that when you're thinking about the fund that is the Prologis Venture, is it a fund? Is that fair to say? Am I calling it the right? Is this a fund? Is this a venture arm? What can I call it for the rest of this show?
Yeah, call it the venture arm. Call us Prologis Ventures.
Prologis
the venture
Ventures.
arms of Prologis.
Got it.
And to answer your question quickly, we invest off the balance sheet.
Yeah.
So we have an evergreen balance sheet to invest off of. So unlike typical institutional venture capital groups, they raise capital from investors, maybe sovereign wealth funds, family offices, and they have LPs. Our LP is Prologis.
Got it. And that's again, I think would be consistent with some of the examples or some of the models I was speaking to early, which I think again is actually where, if not handled properly, challenges could come in, because the owner of that P&L on the other side now has, in a more of a traditional venture fund, those LPs are typically not as close as they would be in a model like this, maybe literally and figuratively. And so I think that's kind of the magic, is keeping enough autonomy, enough clear air to be able to make the types of decisions at the rate of mistake that has to be acceptable in order to run a successful venture arm. Which is in many ways counterintuitive to the other side of the business, and where I see a lot of these failing, because they want sort of the cake and eat it too model, where get the returns, don't take the risk. We've done it over here, you should be able to do it over there, but these are inherently different businesses and everything about them. But I wanted to say earlier is that what I think is really important is that, and this applies I think to many, many businesses, and I think businesses that do this, agnostic of who you are, where you sit in any value chain, you said I think the key thing is that what you're focusing on is not what is good for Prologis, but what is good for the customer. And ultimately, my belief is that, where those who deliver the most value will win. And all of the accolades, such as profitability and scalability, are really the long tail effect of those things. And so leaning into value and starting there, it becomes quite a simple game if you trust the process and you trust the long tail outcome of delivering value. And so you guys are thinking about this, I think, in a really interesting and smart way, in that your customer base is, Prologis becomes almost lead gen for you to a degree, in terms of what it is that we're trying to solve for. What are the customer problems? You mentioned this plainly, and then finding solutions that'll solve for those problems. And it's a really it's quite a nice recipe for success. So good on you guys for identifying that. But I think really, really difficult and requires and deserves kudos is maintaining, sustaining that through all of this. And so I want to take that and flip a little bit to one thing that has, when we first started doing this podcast, my initial purpose of this, and I don't know if I've ever said this on the show, was I actually wanted to start this as an internal tool. So we were going to interview folks from the industry and help the Rose Rocket team level up on all things that were industry specific. We may have a large group of engineers that don't have a lot of transportation experience, which is totally fine, but anything they could get would be helpful. And there was a demand inside the company. So that kind of was the kernel or the genesis of this podcast. Once we got marketing involved, it kind of became a bigger thing, as these things do. But I guess when I think about some of our all hands meetings, and we're a very transparent company, we'll go over stuff that's equivalent to what we would give to investors, and talk a lot of quite frankly, jargon. That to us is just natural native language. But I look around the room at times and I see a lot of blank stares. And so I think for whether I'm selfishly saying for the Rose Rocket community that's going to listen to this, or just the community in general, let's do a thing that I think a lot of podcasts aren't doing. Let's explain what venture capital actually is. And so can you just, it's not an obvious thing. And so can we just get it out once and for all and have a really plain conversation about what venture capital is and how it might be different than other types of financing?
Yeah, for sure. So great comments. So what venture capital is, historically venture capital was a way for founders to, get alternative financing for an idea, right? And so what's still true today, and I'll talk about the difference between institutional venture capital and corporate venture capital, which is who I represent. But venture capitalists, they kind of live by this motto where they're not just looking for a return, but they're looking for venture returns. And venture returns is typically a 10x return on initial investment. And there's a few attributes within an idea and a founder and a team that sort of de-risks that idea of getting a 10x return, right? And what many people say in the industry is you're not looking for the number of hits at bat, but the number of home runs at bat, right? So you might have 10 investments and one of them might return the portfolio. That's all that matters, right, to a lot of institutional investors. And that's kind of what you could hope for. But, I think for many good sort of venture capitalists, there's a lot of pattern recognition on what makes a good company, So I'll that is institutional, and you can read all about on Medium, all these venture capitalists and their funds and partners are talking about how good they are at venture investing. I think what's inherently challenging about the sectors that we operate in, which is the industrial sector, there's a lot of technical debt. I think we operate at a very different. We're playing a little bit of a different game. And what I mean by that is long are the days where you can get some Silicon Valley founder that worked at, a FAANG company, and they're really brilliant technologists. But they can't, they have trouble starting a business in the industrial transportation sector. It's not as simple as let's write code to solve a problem, right? As there's business relationships. There's an inherent understanding of the business rules and dynamics of the industry. And you don't have to over-engineer something, right? If you look out into the market, everyone talks about this in supply chain. The whole supply chain is running on spreadsheets and email. That's true, right? That's 100% true. You're having an engineer write and build a product that's over-engineered where the end user just doesn't understand. It creates more barriers to entry. It creates harder change management, and you're speaking a different language from the end user, right? And so we look at this as, what is phase one of a company? How do you break into a customer and uniquely solve a pain point today? Once you solve that pain point, how do you build product over time that makes your solution sticky and continues to add value, right? And in supply chain world, that's kind of how we see opportunities. And it's not about, are you a brilliant technical founder? It's not about, did you come from, Stanford or Ivy League school? It's about, are you actually solving real pain points? And do you have a business plan that makes sense for the end user on day one? And if those two things don't check out, it's probably not going to work. Yeah.
And I guess, and to avoid you potentially getting lit up with an abundance of inbound emails asking for money, maybe just for everybody, why are technology companies, why do they appear to be, or are they the only types of companies that I'm going to use air quotes here for those listening, qualify for venture?
Yeah, that is a great question. A lot of it has been historical returns on a technology business, right, versus typical manual, maybe infrastructure or hardware businesses. With technology, we're talking about, bits versus atoms. And in bits, right, it scales infinitely. You build it once and you can collect continual value out of that infrastructure and you can scale it, right? With the physical world, and we're seeing that today, right? In the physical world, it doesn't scale infinitely. When you see a lot of these last mile delivery companies, who need warehousing space. The fact of the matter is, a lot of them have raised a bunch of money to scale, but there's no real estate to store the product. And so they're limited by the physical infrastructure. And so from a venture standpoint, what I mentioned earlier, having a 10x return, the only way you can really get that is through infinite scalability through software and technology.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. The scaling is the key. It's a word I think we throw around a lot just in business. It's a very fun word to say, and I think it's used a lot. But it is true scalability cannot be defined by it is constrained by the physical world at a certain point. And I think that's thanks for the clarity, and I hope that brought some value to the world that's listening. So as we talk about Prologis Ventures and we think about the companies that you've been investing in to help your end customers, or at least solve pain points that have been made available to you through asking the right questions. What is happening today? From your, I think you and I originally spoke 3 or 4 years ago, maybe, and so I feel like things have changed quite a bit actually in that period of time. And so maybe talk us through a little bit about, because I think as somebody who's not in this space every day, you notice things when they arrive on your doorstep, but a lot of the stuff that is happening today will be doing so in a couple of years. So the things that you might be seeing now, you saw and probably I saw, 4 years ago when it was concept or early or hadn't quite figured out the right direction, has since sort of pivoted to find the right gap in the market, the right beachhead, if you will. Let's talk a little bit about that. What are you seeing today? What are you excited about? And then we can get into like the broad, conference conversation around digitization of freight. But I hopefully that kind of comes out just through the conversation without us actually having to have the panel on that. So let's make that a goal because I don't want to say that again. So what do you see out there, and what are you guys excited about right now?
Yeah. So happy to nerd out on anything in particular. So I'll start with kind of what we look at as a group at Prologis Ventures, and there's 6 of us, and we continue to grow. So we bucket our focus into 4 large categories. So the first is supply chain logistics, super broad as you can imagine, right? It's forecasting software solutions upstream, it's last mile delivery, e-commerce enablement downstream, and anything in between. And that's freight transportation, over the road trucking, air transport, ocean, right? List continues. Very broad. We probably spend 90% of our time focused on that area. The second is what we call smart buildings. And so this is any new technology that goes into the 4 walls of a building or maybe the yard, right? So this is automation solutions. This is next-gen connectivity. Like the list continues. Anything related to the real estate footprint. Third is prop tech and real estate. We actually don't spend that much time on this sector, given we are the largest real estate company globally, believe it or not, right? And it goes back to our focus on we want to solve customer pain points, not necessarily our own. Over time, we will, right? Naturally, as we become better stewards of technology, I think we will. And then the fourth category is sustainability. And I think, that is a natural one. With 1 billion square feet, we're starting new businesses like electric vehicle charging, right? There's a bunch of orders of Class 8, Class 7 fleets that are electric, and there's no place to charge them. So what better way to start an infrastructure business around EV charging at our facilities to charge these assets that are procured, right? So that's one good example. But the second is, if you're doing everything right within supply chain, right, and these technologies are optimizing on the supply chain, naturally, it's a sustainability play, right? If you're reducing deadhead over the road, right? If you're electrifying your fleets, naturally it's helping the environment. So sustainability is sort of a new area that we're focused on. So those are the broad categories. I think what interests us, or particularly me, a lot, the talent conversation continues to be number one, right? And at this point, I think the labor markets are so tight, and there's not much else, I think technology or a startup can do beyond change management at the enterprise level, right? And so we know labor, we know talent is very challenging. when you look at that particular segment, we try to understand like what are the main problem sets within talent. Like everyone talks about talent and it's very hard. And so when you break it down, it's attracting new talent, it's retaining them, it's upskilling, which I argue is one of the most important, and then safety, right? Like those four main things are so important for a frontline worker, a truck driver, as well as the enterprise. And for the most part, they're underserved, right? Beyond the top 5 shippers who treat employees really well, that area is really fairly underserved. So we invested in all 4 of those categories. So that's really important to us, is solving the labor problem. Within Prologis, we have 800,000 or close to 1 million frontline workers working under our roofs in North America at any given time. Not employed by Prologis, but employed by our customers, right? So it's a lot of people that are within our facilities. And so it's an important topic for us.
I think, one thing that as we're talking this through, you can think about this as a listener, that these guys spend an inordinate amount of time. I use this word very loosely. It's philosophizing about these. I've maybe even made that word up, about these areas. And when you think about a venture job, it's a lot of having a thesis, having a point of view, and finding holes in it. And then, and hopefully galvanizing it through finding minimal amount of holes, and when you do, filling them up. So this is all a load up to my next question, because I feel like this is a very topical conversation, and I feel like in order for you to have a point of view, that when I ask you what you're excited about, that you leaned right into this, you've thought more than a minute about this. So just generally speaking, where has everybody gone in the workforce, and when are they coming back? And what other, because I think this is a very important topic, and I think you're right on in terms of being very topical right now as well. And we're seeing it in real time amongst our customers as well. This is a huge issue. And we're going to spend a lot of actually the next podcasts on talking about this type of stuff directly and indirectly. So maybe what is happening in the labor market as it pertains to warehouse workers? Truck drivers, I think we know about the demographics shift a little bit. It's sort of well documented as such anyway. But what is it that's happening out there, and where do you see some opportunities to remedy what's going on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in the early days of the pandemic, frontline workers were faced with 2 options. One is a COVID relief program that probably paid the same, if not higher, than actually working full-time in a warehouse, right? So that's one thing. And so given the opportunity, I'd rather be at home than work in a warehouse, right? The second thing is, the attrition rate or the turnover rate of a frontline warehouse worker is less than a year. I think it's even, I'd go as far as to say 6 months, right? So typically you're hiring, maybe college students, high school kids, right? Like who are maybe seasonal workers. This isn't going to be a career path. They're there for less than a year, and they're on to the next, right? Either they're back at school, either they have a different job somewhere else, maybe out of the warehouse. But the warehouse job, for the most part, isn't always a long-term career path, right? But it's not to say it shouldn't be. My mom, right? She worked for the USPS. She worked in a warehouse forever, right? And at Sage Robinson, I worked and sold warehousing space. Like it's a great career choice, but I think institutions probably haven't done a good job of setting the stage on what it means to grow your career in the industry. And so one of our portfolio companies, WorkStep, they attract frontline workers for an enterprise. But what's more important than that is retention. And so when you break down, what does it mean to retain somebody? Believe it or not, there's an interesting anecdote where, a warehouse shift manager didn't actually say hi to their employees when they arrived, didn't really communicate. And the turnover rate at that facility versus somebody else who had a great manager, right, and treated their employees really well and just had a human conversation, was night and day. It was completely it was not even comparable. So the small human factors actually make a big difference in retention. And it's stuff that like, it's not a technology thing. The technology platform just happened, to measure something like that. But I think, one of them is perception, where it's okay. Like, I think it's a great career path. At Modex a couple weeks ago, if any of you guys were in Atlanta, I was chatting with one guy. His name was Justin too, actually.
Obviously.
Yeah, it's so funny. He was the oldest Justin I've ever met, by the way. He's
Impossible. How old is he?
He's probably in his late 40s, mid 40s. But Justin's is a young person's name. I haven't met anybody beyond that.
Yeah, not to go too far into that. No, I'll let you go back on that. But I'm born in 1980, and I remember at one point having 4 Justins, including myself, in my class. I feel like that was the peak of Justinhood. But anyway, I digress.
Oh, funny. That's right. And he said, look, he started in a warehouse, and his dad told him, what are you going to work in a warehouse for the rest of your life? And it stuck with him, and he did, actually. He worked in a warehouse for the rest of his life. He became the head of warehousing for a large corporate, and now he works at a really large, successful integration business selling automation, right? Warehousing is here to stay, and it's sexy, and it's necessary. I just think that the industry probably just doesn't do a good job of setting the stage of what it means to grow your career in this space.
I think you nailed something that I think is so abundantly obvious, so ridiculously easy, but so challenging organizationally from an institution perspective. And when I say institution perspective, I mean how you institutionalize being nice. I mean, that was real. I'm not being facetious when I say that. It's because it was you can imagine yourself in that situation. You can imagine yourself coming to a place where you have somebody from a management perspective who is curmudgeon. We've probably all had it. It's curmudgeon-y, who's negative, who just kind of gives off a bad vibe, and that affects you. It makes you fearful, makes you feel insecure about your day. I can totally picture, especially those with higher sort of empath barometers, can really be affected very heavily by the feelings and the dispositions of others. And so when you flip that on its head and say, this person is simply nice, you look forward to seeing that person, they're warm, they look you in the eyes, they smile. I mean, that could, and as it sounds like it's being proven to a point even, and again, it's not surprising, but very, very hard to build in the business if it doesn't come from very, very, if not the top. It's one of those, it's an ethos thing almost. And so I think that's actually I think that's a great takeaway for the listeners, in that, look, we can't all be a Prologis. We can't all compete at that level. We're gonna get outspent, whether you're Rose Rocket, like engineers going to get hired by Airbnb, they're going to outpay us. That's going to happen. We can't compete with them on that pay. You can't, as a 100-truck trucking company, you can't compete with JB Hunt like on almost everything. But what you can control is the way in which that you behave and the way in which you treat others. And that's a competitive 100%. Advantage we can all introduce into our businesses at any given moment.
Absolutely.
On that note, we're gonna wrap up there. Listen, Justin, that was a really insightful conversation, and I really appreciate how articulate you were and how I think much content came out of your words. You don't waste a lot of words. You speak very well, and it really comes across. And I think there was a ton of value there for everybody. I know for myself that was really great. So thanks for being here with us, and I look forward to catching up with you at some point in the future.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure, and thanks for your time, Justin.
Okay, man. Thanks. See ya.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening, and be sure to like and subscribe. See you next time.